And 1, 2, 3, go. Thank you. And good evening, depending on what part of the world you are, to all of my imaginary friends. It's a pleasure, and I'm happy to be here with you. It is Sunday night at 7 o'clock in California, which is the large chunk of land at the leftmost end of the United States. Just in case any of you were looking for it and couldn't find it, that's the one. So anyway, I'm here, you're here, we're all here, things are good. I am going to go back to reading Shadowmarch in just a wee few minutes. Trying to think if there's anything else to update people on. When I was doing my 2 a.m. reading, I spent about 5 minutes blathering on about COVID vaccinations and all of that, which I will mention only because I've told you guys where we all are on these things before. So we're currently 2 people have had both, and the other 4 people are about to have, in another week or so, will have their second. So we're doing pretty well on all that. I hope you guys are too. Those of you who have not been vaccinated, I hope you soon will be. And so that's that on that. I made another announcement, which was with great embarrassment and shame, in which I said it's finally become clear to me that in today's publishing economy, I cannot stick my publishers with another 1,600-page manuscript, so it's almost 100% certain now that The Navigator's Children is going to have to be broken up into 2 pieces. And I don't have any more information on that. I assume that the first half will still be published whenever the whenever it was previously scheduled for. And as for the second one, don't know about that yet. We'll have to wait and see. We would hope it would be fairly soon thereafter. So that's the skinny on that. And that is where I am there. Let me quickly just run through and see who has signed in and said hello. Sweetie, just get up and walk through, honey. That's kind of... Plus, they can see the floor. They're used to seeing the cat creep through. There's Labiel in her Rebel t-shirt. Yeah, we're doing red and black today. And pink, of course, because of the hair and the skin. Anyway, so who's out there? Kelly, hello, good to see you. Mr. Ron, hello, hope things are good out there in Arizona. We miss you. Jared, nice to see you. Yes, I am feeling better, certainly better than last week. Emily, hello. Carl, hello, good to see you too. Becca, yes, excellent, nice to see you, and I'm very pleased about having gotten the shot too. Mahmoud, a pleasure as always. Yes, all is well and good. And Barban, nice to see you too. Nancy, hello Nancy. I missed you guys last week too. It was very strange not doing it. Suddenly the weekend it was like when somebody squeezes a balloon and bits pop out in between your fingers in kind of weird blobby ways. That's what it felt like. All my normal weekend scheduling was, I mean, yes, I was lying around feeling kind of sick and sad for myself, but I was still up and around and doing things, from time to time. And it was just very strange to have suddenly these two major things, which have determined my weekend for over a year, just gone. And as a result, I was very disoriented. I was wandering around going, who am I? What am I? What does it all mean? Anyway, Kenneth, hello, good to see you. Kyra, former Mantis. Aha, Mantis was a high-ranking position on the Shadowmarch board. As you will see as we talk more about mantises within the Shadowmarch book that we're now reading. Cliff, hi, good to see you. Kristen, pleasure to see you too. Medardo, Senor Dueñas, always a pleasure. Greg, hi Greg, how are you? Michael, good to see you, Michael. And yes, Ron, of course, is a mantis. Regina, good to see you too. Charlotte, North Carolina. I have one of my very best friends for most of my life. Lives in North Carolina. Hope things are going well for you out there. And who else we got? Claudia, good to see you. Josh, yeah, you like my action glove? My action glove. Yeah, no, it's my bad wrist glove. But that's okay. I'm not unhappy. It's like there's a lot of worse things that you could have, like imaginary friends. But as far as I know, you folks are not completely imaginary. So, I'm doing pretty well on that front. Tim, good to see you. Mike, pleasure. And have we got everybody else? Jared, hello. Okay, have we got everybody? Yeah, Deb was there in the background, so people will all stop to say hi to Deb. She's gone already. She's just disappeared. She's taken her victory lap around the house. She was actually trying to crawl when she saw that I was already online. She was going to crawl through in the background, which I thought, first off, people might think that I demanded that. And if you're going to come in my office while I'm doing my broadcast, you better crawl through. But secondly, it's because, I know everybody can see the floor in here because they're always going, oh, there's your cat. So didn't seem like a good ploy altogether. Hi, Sherry, if I didn't already say that. Hello, Janice. Hello, Jeremy. And Margaret. Nice to see you. I'm glad you're joining us. What a pleasure. And everybody else, Brenna. Hello, Brenna. And so, yes, Sherry and others, I am feeling better. And just, almost normal. As close to normal as I ever get, which admittedly is still a few degrees off the port bow. But you take what you can get. So, having mentioned those two things, I am going to jump into the reading. We just finished Chapter 6, and although I won't go into great detail, what I will say, for those of you who haven't read the story, haven't heard it before, which there may be some, I'm hoping there'll be at least one or two, who are experiencing this for the first time. Anyway, for those who have not experienced it before, in the midst of a complicated discussion on whether to essentially trade Bryony off to the bandit who has kidnapped their father and is holding him in Hyrosol, a major city to the south, while Kendrick was going to be making his decision. Kendrick is the oldest of the Eden siblings and is the the Prince Regent, we would say, the reigning prince while his father is gone. Kendrick was going to make that decision, but in the middle of the night, Kendrick was murdered. And of course, we do not know why or how or what that means, who did it, why they did it, etc., etc. And trust me, you aren't going to find out for a while if you don't know the story already. Anyway, so here we are, Chapter 7, Sisters of the Hive. Oh, and you haven't missed anything if you don't recognize this character in this setting, because we have zigzagged and we are going to a new part of the story now. So, Chapter 7, Sisters of the Hive. Days. Each light between sunrise and sunset is worth dying for at least once. From the Bonefall Oracles. The smoky scent of the jasmine candles and the perpetual sleepy buzz of the Hive temple, the half-frightened, half-exalted breathing of the other girls, all the sounds and odors that surrounded her at the moment the world changed beyond all recognition, would never again completely leave her mind. But how could it be otherwise? It would have been overwhelming enough just to meet the living God on earth, the autarch, Sulepus Bishak Amzis III, elect of Nushash, the Golden One, master of the great tent, and the falcon throne, lord of all places and happenings. 1,000 praises to his name. But what happened to Quiniton at this moment was beyond belief, and always would be. Even a year later, when she would have to abandon a life of splendid leisure in the palace of seclusion, and run in terror of death through the dark streets of Great Zis, every moment of this day would still be alive inside her. A day that had begun, like many others, with her friend Dooney poking her out of bed in the darkness before sunrise. Dooney had been so aflutter with excitement that morning she could barely keep her voice in a proper whisper. "Oh, get up, Kinya! Get up! It's today! He's coming! To the Hive!" The events of that day would lift Quiniton up to heavenly heights, to honors not just undreamed of, but so impossible as to be ludicrous even to imagine. Still, if she had known all of what was to come, she would have done anything to escape, as a jackal in a trap will gnaw through its own leg in its desperation for freedom. They hurried down the corridor, 2 lines of girls with hair still damp from the water they had splashed on their faces and heads in the ritual cleansing, their robes sticking to their bodies, making a lively chill that would not last long in the rising heat of the day. Quiniton's own black hair hung in lank, loose ringlets, the odd reddish streak hardly visible when it was wet. When she was a baby, the old men of Cat's Eye Street had called it a witch streak and made the past evil sign. But no sign of witchery or anything out of the ordinary at all had followed. Some of the other children had called her Striped Cat, but other than that, by the time she was old enough to range the streets and alleys in the neighborhood of her parents' home, no one paid any more attention to it than they did to a mole on the nose or crossed eyes. "But why is he coming here?" Quiniton asked, still not quite awake. "To find out what the bees think, of course," Dooney said. "Think about what?" The priestess and the hive mistress often spoke about autarchs coming to seek the wisdom of the sacred bees, tiny oracles of the all-powerful fire god Nushash, but the names they cited were from the impossibly distant past. Zarpedon, Lepthus, rulers whom Quiniton had only ever heard mentioned during the boasting of the great hive's caretakers. But now, the real living autarch, the god on earth himself, was coming to consult with the fire god's bees. It was hard to believe. Her father had been a priest in the temple of Nushash all his life, but had never been favored with a visit from an actual autarch. Quiniton had been a sworn acolyte priestess for scarcely more than a year. It almost didn't seem fair. This autarch, Sulepus, was a fairly young god on earth still. He had only been on the falcon throne for a short time. Quiniton could remember his father, the old autarch, Parnad, dying, followed more violently by several of his other sons who had been the current autarch's rivals, when she had first gone to serve the bees. The funereal hush that had lain so deeply on the Hive temple that she had been surprised later to discover things were not always that way. Perhaps the autarch's youthfulness explained why he was doing astounding things like visiting a smoke-filled apiary in one of the more obscure corners of Nushash's sprawling, ancient fire temple. "Do you think he'll be handsome?" Dooney asked in a strangled whisper, clearly shocked and thrilled by her own daring. Sulepus had spent most of his first months on the throne chastising some of the outer provinces, who had thought, falsely and to their subsequent regret, that the new young autarch might prove timid. Thus, he had not found time for the sort of processions or public events that made the common people feel as though they knew their ruler. Quiniton could only shrug and shake her head. She couldn't think of the autarch in that way, and it hurt her head even to try. It was like a worm trying to decide whether a mountain was the right color. She wasn't angry, though. She knew her friend was frightened, and who wouldn't be? They were going to meet the living God, a being as far above them as the stars, someone who could snuff all their lives more easily than Quinniton could kill a fly. For a brief moment, it was always too brief, the acolytes passed out of the narrow passageway into the high windowed gallery that crossed from the living quarters to the temple complex. 12 to 15 steps at most, depending on how quickly the leading girl was marching. But it was the only chance Quinniton had to see below her the magnificent city of Great Zis, a city in which she had once, if not exactly run free, at least lived at street level, among people that spoke in normal tones of voice. In the Hive, scarcely anyone ever spoke above a whisper, although sometimes the whispers could be as intrusive as shouts. "Do you think he'll speak? What do you think he'll sound like? Quiet, Dooney." Quinniton had just a few moments each day to savor the world outside the temple, even if she only saw it at a distance, and she missed it very much. As always, she opened her eyes wide as they crossed the windowed gallery, trying to drink in every bit she could absorb. The blue sky, bleached mostly gray with the smoke of a million fires. The pearl-white rooftops stretching far beyond sight, like an endless beach covered with squared stones. Interrupted here and there were the towers of the greatest families, thrust up into the air. The towers' colorful stripes and gold ornaments made them look like the sleeves of splendid garments, as though each tower were a man's fist raised toward the heavens. But, of course, the rich men of the tower families had no complaints against the heavens. Instead of clenched in a fist, their tower hands should be spread wide in case the gods should decide to throw down even more good fortune on people already choked with it. Quinniton often wondered what would have happened if her own family had been one of the ruling elite, instead of only a middling merchant family, her father a landholder instead of a mere functionary in the administration of one of Nushash's larger temples. She supposed it could have been worse. He could have been a lackey of one of the other gods, fast losing power to the great fire god. "We are so lucky to have this for you," her parents had told her when she had been admitted as an acolyte of the Sisters of the Hive, although she herself had prayed, blasphemy, but there it was, that it would not happen. "Far richer families than ours would shed blood for such an honor. You will be serving in the Autarch's own temple." The temple, of course, had proved to be a sprawl of connected buildings that seemed only slightly smaller than Great Zis itself, and Quinniton one of so many hundreds of Hive sister acolytes that it was doubtful even the priestess in charge of her living quarters knew more than a few of their names. "I don't know what I'll do if he looks at me. If I faint, will he have me put to death? Please, Dooney." "No, I'm sure people faint all the time. He's a god, after all." "You say that so strangely, Quinn. Are you feeling ill?" Her momentary glimpse of freedom ended. The mighty city disappeared as they stepped out of the gallery and into the next corridor. One of Quinniton's aunts had told her that Zis was so big that a bird could live its entire life while flying from one side of the city to the other, perching along the way to sleep, eat, and perhaps even start a family. Quinniton was not certain that was true. Her father had poured scorn on the notion. But it was certainly true that there was a world outside so much bigger than her own constrained circumstances, so much more vast than her march from living quarters to temple each morning and back again each evening, that she ached to be a bird, flaunting herself above a city that never ended. Even fretful, chattering Dooney at last fell silent as they passed into the great hypostyle hall, awed as they all were every day by the size of the stone pillars shaped like cedars that stretched up a dozen times the girl's height or more before disappearing into the inky shadows beneath the ceiling. When she had first come to the temple, Quiniton had thought it strange that Nushash should live in such a dark place, but after a while she had come to see how right it was. Fire was never brighter than when it bloomed out of blackness, never more important than when it was the only light in a sunless place. At the end of the great hall, the eyes of Nushash were opening even now as the temple's oldest priest lit the great lanterns, moving more slowly than it seemed any human being could manage and yet still be alive, extending his long lighting pole with the creeping pace of an insect that thinks it might be observed by a hungry bird. The priest was one of the only men Quiniton and her fellow acolytes saw during the conduct of their daily duties. Despite the fact that he was favored, and thus a reason far more compelling than mere age ensured he was no threat to a large congregation of virgins, Quiniton thought the Hive sisters must have picked him because he was old enough to be doubly safe. They certainly had not picked him for his skill and dispatch. He must have already been at his maddeningly slow work for hours this morning, she decided. More than half the lanterns had been kindled. Their flicker exposed the looping lines of the sacred writing on the wall behind them, the gold characters of the hymn to the fire god glinting red with reflected flame. It is from you, O Great One, that all good things arise. Mighty Nushash, O bright-eyed, the foundation of heaven's hearth, we ourselves arise from you, and like smoke, we live in the air for a short time only, proceeding from your warmth, but we survive forever in the depth of the flame which is your immortal heart. Beyond the massive and ornately decorated archway lay the maze and inner sanctuary of Nushash himself, chief god of the world, the lord of fire whose wagon was the sun, a wagon bigger even than the autarch's earthly palace, Quiniton's father had bragged, its wheels higher than the tallest tower. Her father, Cheshret, was nothing if not proud of his employer. Mighty Nushash crossed the sky each day in this great cart, and then, despite all the snares that Argal, the Dark One, laid for him, despite the monsters that thronged his path, continued on through the night beyond the dark mountains, so he could bring the light of fire back to the sky each morning, thus allowing the earth and all who dwelled on it to live. Somewhere beyond that archway glowered the great golden statue of Nushash himself, as well as all the endless corridors and chambers of his great temple, the chapels and the priests' living quarters, and the storage rooms so filled with offerings that a vast part of his army of priests had no other task except to receive and catalog them. Beyond that archway lay the seat of the fire god's power on earth, and it formed, along with the autarch's palace, the axis of the entire spinning world. But of course, girls like Quiniton were not allowed into that part of the temple, nor were any other women, not even the autarch's paramount wife or his venerated mother. The procession of acolyte priestesses turned left down the smaller hallway, hurrying on softly pattering feet toward the temple of the Hive, of the fire god's sacred bees, to give it its full name. If the youngest Hive sisters had not been waiting weeks for this day, it was at this moment that they would have first realized today was not to be like the others. A high priestess herself was waiting for them, along with her chief acolyte. Although she was not as venerated as the oracle Mudri, High Priestess Rugan was the mistress of the Hive Temple, and thus one of the most powerful women in Zis. That being the case, she was a remarkably ordinary and even kindly woman, although she did not suffer foolish behavior well. High Priestess Rugan clapped her hands, and the girls all fell silent, gathered in a semicircle around her. "You all know what day this is," she said in her deep voice, "and who is coming?" She touched her own ceremonial robe and hood, as if to be sure she had remembered to put them on. "I do not need to tell you. The temple must be spotless." Quiniton suppressed a groan. They had been cleaning all week. How could it get any cleaner? Rugan's face was appropriately stern. You will give thanks as you work. You will praise Nushash and our great autarch for this honor. You will consider the monumental importance to all our lives of this visit. And most importantly, as you work, you will reflect on the sacred bees and their own ceaseless, uncomplaining toil. They are so beautiful, said the chief acolyte. Quiniton paused for a moment in her work to look at the great hives behind their clouds of smoky silk netting. Vast cylinders of fired clay, decorated with bands of copper and gold and warmed in winter by pots of boiling water set beneath the bulky ceremonial stands. One of the least enjoyable of the acolyte's jobs, Quiniton had more than a few burns on her hands and wrists where a spill had scalded her. The fire god's bees lived in houses far more splendid than any but the most exalted and fortunate of men. As if they knew it, the bees were singing quietly, contentedly, a hum deep enough to make the ears tickle and hair lift on the back of the neck. Yes, Mistress Crissa, said Quiniton, meaning it. It was perhaps the thing she liked best about the Hive Temple. The hives themselves, bees busy and serene. They truly are. It is a wonderful day for us. The chief acolyte was herself still a young woman, pretty in a thin-faced way, when one learned to look past the scar that ran from her eye to her cheek. The scar made her the subject of much giggling speculation in the acolyte's quarters. Quiniton had never summoned the nerve to ask her how she had received it. An entirely wonderful day. But for some reason, child, you do not seem entirely happy. Quiniton took a breath, suddenly shocked and frightened that her strange mood should show on her face. Oh, no, mistress. I am the luckiest girl in the world to be here, to be a Hive sister. The chief acolyte didn't look like she entirely believed her, but she nodded approvingly. It's true. There are probably more girls who would happily take your place here than there are grains of sand on the beach, and you have had the even greater good fortune of having caught the eye of Eminence Rugan herself. Otherwise you might not have been selected out of so many other worthy candidates. Crissa reached out and patted Quiniton on the arm. It was your clever tongue, you know, although you still need to learn when not to use it. I think Her Eminence has hopes you might be a chief acolyte yourself one day, which would be an even greater honor. She nodded a little, acknowledging her own hard work and good fortune. Still, it is a high, lonely calling, and sometimes it can be difficult to leave behind your family and friends. I know it was for me when I was young. Before Quiniton could seize this chance to ask the revered and mysterious Mistress Crissa some questions about her childhood before the temple, the nets in front of the hives billowed a little in a sudden draft, although the weight of hundreds of bees clinging to them kept them from moving too much. The breeze carried something through the great room, a whisper of sudden fear and excitement that made both the chief acolyte and her young charges straighten and turn to the door, where the high priestess had suddenly appeared, her arms held up, her hands open in the air like flowers. Praises to the highest, breathed Crissa. He is here. Quiniton got down on her knees beside the chief acolyte. A murmur of footsteps became louder, swishing and booming on the polished stone floors as soldiers began to file in, each with a great curved sword on his belt and bearing on his shoulder a long bell-mouthed tube of brightly polished, figured steel. The autarch's leopards, these had to be. No one else was allowed to wear that black and gold armor. It was astonishing. She had never thought to see any men here in the Hive's great portico, let alone 100 of them with muskets. This rarity was followed by several dozen robed priests of Nushash, then an even larger troop of soldiers, these carrying more conventional, but still frightening weapons, long spears and swords. At last the shuffling of feet stopped. Quiniton sneaked a look over at Mistress Crissa, whose face was radiant with excitement and something even stronger, a sort of joy. A vast litter appeared in the doorway, a thing of gold-painted wood and heavy curtains, embroidered with the wide-winged falcon of the royal family. The brawny soldiers who held it set the litter down just to the side of the doorway, and one of them leaped forward to pull back the curtains. Although none of the women in the temple chamber said a word, Quiniton thought she could feel them, dozens of them all drawing breath at the same time. A face appeared from the shadows in the depths of the litter, picked out by the lanterns. Quiniton swallowed, although for a moment it seemed impossible to do so. The autarch was a monster. No, not quite a monster, she saw at her second glance, but the youth in the litter was bent and gnarled as though by extreme age, and his head was far too large for his spindly body. He blinked and looked absently from side to side, like a sleepy man realizing he has opened the wrong door, then withdrew into the darkness of his curtained bower once more. Even as Quiniton gaped, the leopard guards all lifted their guns off their shoulders, held them high, then slammed their feet against the floor with a deafening report. Boom! Boom! For a moment she thought the guns had all gone off, and some of the Hive sisters let out shrieks of fear and dismay. As the echoes died, a half-dozen more men in black and gold armor appeared in the doorway, and then a figure almost as strange as the one in the litter followed them into the temple room. He was tall, half a head above the biggest of the leopards, but not as freakishly so as he first appeared. It was the length of his neck and the narrowness of his face that made him seem so unusual, and the spidery stretch of his fingers as he raised his hand. Beneath the high, dome-shaped crown, his face, too, seemed like an ordinary face that had been pulled a bit beyond its appropriate shape. A long jaw and a curved, bony nose like a hawk's beak that matched oddly with his youth. Smooth brown flesh stretched tight across the skull. He wore a small, trimmed black beard, and his eyes seemed unnaturally large and bright as he stared around the room. A few of the Nushash priests stepped forward and began chanting and swinging their censers, filling the air around the tall young man with smoke. "Who is that?" Quiniton whispered under cover of the priest's noise. Crissa was clearly shocked that she should dare to whisper, even when it was more or less safe to do so under the cover of the priest's voices. "The autarch, you fool girl!" It certainly made more sense that the tall one was their ruler. He had an undeniable power to him. But then, who is that? Who is the man in the litter? The Skotarch, of course, his heir. Now be silent. Quiniton felt stupid. Her father had once told her that the Skotarch, the autarch's ceremonial heir, was sickly, but she had entirely forgotten and had certainly never guessed him to be so obviously afflicted. Still, considering that the autarch's own life and rule hinged on the health and continued well-being of the Skotarch by ancient Xixian tradition, Quiniton couldn't help wondering at the autarch's choice of such a frail reed. It didn't matter, she reminded herself. These folk were as much above her. All the doings of the High House were as far above her as the stars in the sky. "Where is the mistress of this temple?" The autarch's voice was high-pitched but strong. It rang in the great room like a silvery bell. Eminence Rugen came forward, head bowed, her usual brisk walk, transformed almost into the slinking of a frightened beast. That, more than the soldiers or priests or anything else, made Quiniton understand that she was in the presence of matchless, terrifying power. Rugen bowed to no one else that Quiniton had ever seen. "Your glory reflects on us all, O master of the great tent," Rugen said, voice quavering a little. "The hive welcomes you, and the bees are gladsome in your presence." Mother Mudri is coming to offer you any wisdom the sacred bees of Nushash can grant. She begs your generous indulgence, Golden One. She is too old to wait here in the drafty outer temple without great discomfort. The look that crossed the autarch's corvine features was almost a smirk. She does me too much honor, does old Mudri. You see, I haven't come to consult the oracle. I want nothing from the bees. Even cowed by the presence of 100 armed soldiers, many sisters of the Hive couldn't restrain a gasp of surprise. Some of the noises even sounded suspiciously like disapproval. Come to the temple and not consult the sacred bees? I'm afraid I don't understand, O Golden One. Clearly confused, Eminence Rugen took a step back, then sank to one knee. The High Priest's messenger said you wished to come to the Hive because you were searching for something. The autarch actually laughed. It had a strange edge to it, something that made Quiniton's flesh prickle on her arms. The curtain of the Skotarch's litter twitched as though the sick young man was peering out. Yes, he did, the autarch said, and I am. Come, Panhisser, where are you? A bulky shape in dark robes with a long, narrow beard like a gray waterfall trundled out from behind the leopard guards. Panhisser, the high priest of Nushash, Quiniton guessed, and thus another of the most powerful people in the entire continent of Zan. He looked as fat and unconcerned with trivial human things as one of the drones in the sacred hives. Yes, Golden One? You said that this was the place I would find the bride I sought. Panhisser didn't look anywhere near as worried as the Hive priestesses. He had already overseen the collection of hundreds of brides for the autarch, so perhaps this seemed a bit routine. She is definitely here, Golden One, we know that. Ah, is she now? Then I will find her myself. The autarch took a few steps, his eyes sweeping along the rows of kneeling, terrified Hive sisters. Quiniton had no better idea of what was going on than any of her comrades, but she saw the autarch and his leopards moving across the temple toward them, and so she turned her face toward the floor and tried to stay as still as the paving stones. This is the one, said the autarch from somewhere nearby. Yes, that is the bride, Golden One, said Panhisser. The master of the great tent cannot be fooled. Good. She will be brought to me this evening, along with her parents. It was only when the guard's rough hands closed on her arms and lifted her to her feet that Quiniton realized that this astounding, unbelievable thing had happened to no one but her. Chapter 8. The Hiding Place. Meadow and sky. Dew rises. Rain falls. Between them is mist. Between them lies all that is. From the Bonefall Oracles. It had been the longest hour of his life. The young woman he admired beyond any other, without a hope of his affection. Let me start that one again. It had been the longest hour of his life. The young woman he admired beyond any other, without a hope of his affection ever being returned, had just spat on him and blamed him for her brother's murder, and he was not at all certain she was wrong. Bleeding runnels showed where she had gouged his cheeks with her nails. The wounds burned, stinging with tears and sweat, both his own. But worst of all, his failure, the failure of every man sworn to protect the royal family, pressed on him like the walls of a lead coffin. King Olin had been gone for months, held prisoner in a far country. Now his son and heir was dead, butchered in his own bedchamber in the middle of Southmarch Castle. If the world was indeed ending, thought Ferris Vanson, captain of the Royal Guard, then he hoped the end would come quickly. At least it would mean an end to this most horrible of nights. Hierarch Sizel, shocked, wide-eyed, and murmuring to himself, had hurried from his guest chambers in the Tower of Summer, and was now struggling to remember the words to the death rite. He had not been an ordinary priest for a long time, as he leaned over Prince Kendrick's bloodied corpse. The dead prince had been lifted onto the bed and unfolded from his death spasm. He lay now with eyes closed and arms at his sides, in a semblance of peaceful rest. A cloth stitched with gold had been draped over his wounded body so that only the naked shoulders and face were showing. But scarlet flowers of blood were already beginning to bloom through the covering. Chavin, the physician, as pale-faced and disturbed as Vanson had ever seen him, waited to examine the murdered prince before the royal body was taken by the maids of Kernios to be prepared for the funeral. Wordless as survivors of a terrible battle, the twins had not left their dead brother's side. Blood had dried on their nightclothes. Bryony, in particular, was so red-painted that a newcomer would be forgiven in mistaking her for the prince's killer. She kneeled, weeping, on the floor by the bed, her head resting on Kendrick's arm. The prince must be uncomfortable, Vanson thought absently, then remembered as if in a dream that the prince was now beyond all bodily discomfort. Lord Constable Avon Brone, huge and deep-voiced and as much a part of the Eden family as anyone not of the blood could be, was perhaps the only one who could even think of trying to move the princess from her dead brother's side. "There are things to do, my lady," he rumbled. "It's not meet that he should lie here untended. Come away and let the physician and the death maids do their work." "I'm not leaving him." She would not even glance at Brone. "Talk sense to her," the Lord Constable growled at her pale twin brother. Barrack looked half his years, a frightened child, his hair still tousled from bed. "Help me, Highness," Brone asked him more gently. "We will never find what happened here, never discover the cruel hand that did this if we must work with a mourning family watching us." "The Dark Man!" Bryony lifted her head, a sudden feverish light in her eyes. "My maid, woke, dreaming of a Dark Man. Where's that villain Dawet? Did he do this? Did he kill my... Her mouth curled, lost shape. Then she was weeping again, a raw, heartbreaking sound. She pressed her head against Kendrick's side. "My lady, you must come," Brone told her, tugging his beard in anxious frustration. "You'll have a chance for a proper farewell to the prince. I promise you." "He's not a prince. He's my brother." "He was both, Highness." It's time to get up, Bryony," Barrack said weakly, as if telling a lie he did not think anyone would believe. Avon Brone looked to the guard captain for help. Vanson moved forward, hating what his duty made him do. Brone already had one of the girl's arms in his broad hands. Vanson took the other, but Bryony resisted, glaring at him with such complete hatred that he let her pull away. "Princess," Brone hissed, "your older brother is dead, and you cannot change that. Look around you. Look there. Leave me alone. No God's curse this night. Look out the door." Outside the Prince Regent's chamber, dozens of pale faces hovered silently in the corridors, phantoms of lantern light. The castle's residents were crowded there, watching in disbelief and horror. "You and your brother are the heads of the Eden family now," Brone told her in a harsh whisper. "The people need to see you be strong. Your grief should wait until you're private. Can you not stand and be strong for your people?" At first she seemed more likely to spit at him than speak. But after a long moment, Bryony shook her head, then wiped her cheeks and eyes with the back of her hand. You are right, Lord Constable, she said, but I will not forgive you for it. I am not in my post to be either loved or forgotten, mistress. Come, you are in mourning, but you are still a princess. Let us all get on with you. Let us all get on with what we have to do here. He offered her his wide arm. No, thank you, she said. Beric? Her twin took an unsteady step toward her. We will go to the chapel. Bryony Eden's face was a mask now, hard and pale as fired white clay. We will pray for Kendrick there. We will light candles. And if the Lord Constable and this supposed captain of the guard manage to find the one who killed our brother under their very noses, we will be composed to pass fitting sentence on them. Taking her brother's arm, she stepped around Ferris Vanson without a look, as though he were a cow or sheep, something too stupid to clear the way of its own volition. As she passed, he could see that her eyes were brimming over again, but that she held her head straight. The servants and others in the hall shrank back against the walls to let them pass. Some called out fearful questions, but Bryony and her brother walked through them as though they were no more than trees, their voices only the rush of the wind. Eminence, will you go with them? Avenbrone asked Hierarch Sizel when the twins had passed from earshot. We need them out of the way so we may do our work, but my heart sinks for them in the kingdom. Will you go and lead them in prayers? Help them to find strength. Sizel nodded and followed the prince and princess. Vanson could not help being impressed at the way his master had dispatched the hierarch, a man of the gods who answered only to the Trigonarch himself in distant Cyan, as though he were a lowly groom. When they were all gone, Brone scowled and spat. Such disrespect in the prince's death chamber shocked Vanson, but the Lord Constable seemed caught up with other things. At least the Raven's Gate is closed for the night, he growled. But tomorrow, word of this will move from house to house through the city like a fire, and will be carried to all the lands around whether we like it or not. We cannot shut out questions or seal in the truth. The young prince and princess will need to show themselves soon, or we will have great fear in the people. There is a hole in the kingdom now, Ferris Vanson realized, a terrible hole. This might be the time when a strong man could step in and fill it. What if Avenbrone thought of himself as that sort of man? He certainly looked the type. The Lord Constable was as tall as Vanson, who was not a small fellow, but Brone was almost twice as wide, with a huge bushy beard and shoulders as broad as his substantial belly. In his black cloak, which Ferris suspected he had simply thrown over his night things, then stuffed his feet into boots, the older man looked like a rock on which a ship might founder, or on which a great house might be built. And there were others in the kingdom who might also think themselves a good size to wear a crown. As the physician Chavin busied himself with the prince's body, Avenbrone moved to stand over the two slain guardsmen. This one is Gwatkin, yes. I do not recognize the other. Caddick, a new fellow. Ferris frowned. Just days earlier, the men had been mocking Caddick Longlegs for never having kissed a girl. Now the youth was new in death as well. There would have been two more here, but I thought I would rather keep an eye on the end of the keep where the foreigners are lodged. He swallowed an abrupt surge of bile. There should have been two more to guard the prince. And have you spoken to those guards yet? By the gods, man, what if they're all dead and the foreigners are now ranging the keep with bloody swords? I have long since sent a messenger and had one back. One of my best men leads them, Dyer. You know him. And he swears the Hyrosoline envoy and his company have not left their rooms. Roan nudged one of the guard's bodies with his boot toe. Slashed. A fine bit for swordplay. A bit fine for swordplay, looks like. But how could a troop of men attack and murder the prince without anyone knowing? And how could something smaller than a troop do such grim work? I do not know how it could be a troop and go unnoticed, my lord. The corridors were not empty. Ferris stared at Gwatkin's wide-eyed face, the jaw hanging open as though death had been more a surprise than anything else. But the servants did hear something earlier in the evening, arguing, some shouting but muffled. They could make out no words and did not recognize the voices, but all agreed it did not sound like men fighting for their lives. Where are the prince's body servants? Where are his pages? Sent away. Ferris could not help but smart a little under Brone's questioning. Did the Lord Constable think that because Guard Captain Vanson's father was a farmer, the son had no wit? That he hadn't thought to see to these things himself? The prince himself sent them away. They thought it was because he wanted to be alone, either to think or perhaps to discuss his sister's fate privately with someone. Someone? They do not know, Lord. He was alone when he sent them away. They ended by sleeping in the kitchen with the pot boys. It was one of the pages, returning for a religious trinket of some sort, who found the dying prince and raised the alarm. I will speak to that one, then. Roan carefully lowered his heavy frame into a squat beside the murdered guardsman. He pulled at the nearest man's jerkin. He is wearing armor. Most of the blood on him comes from a slashed throat. That is what killed him. The other two? His throat was slashed and bleeding, but that wasn't what did for him, my lord. Look at his face. Roan squinted at the second body. What happened to his eye? Something sharp went through it, my lord, and deep into his skull, too, from what I can see. Avon Brone whistled in surprise and levered himself upright, like a bear stumbling out of its cave in spring. If we cannot find a troop of assassins, then have we but one killer? Our murderer must be a fine fighter to kill 2 armored men, and Kendrick is not clumsy with a sword either. Startled by his own words, Brone made a pass evil. Was not. Did he have a chance to arm himself? We have seen no sign of any weapon yet, except the guards. Vanson thought for a moment. Perhaps somehow the prince was attacked first. Perhaps he sent these guards out on some errand, as he did his other servants, and they returned to find the murderer had already struck. Brone turned to Chavin, who had removed the golden cloth and was probing at the body. The Prince Regent already looked like a tomb statue, Ferris thought, cold and white as marble. Can you guess what killed him? The Lord Constable asked. The royal physician looked up, his round face troubled. Oh, yes. No, better to say I can show you why he died. Come, look. Ferris and the Lord Constable moved to the bedside. Now it was Ferris who helplessly made the pass evil, a fist around his thumb, to keep Kernios, the death god, from noticing him. He had seen many scores of violent death since his childhood, but he had not made the gesture for as long as he could remember. The prince's bloodless pallor and yellow hair made him appear disquietingly like his younger sister. Ferris suddenly felt troubled to be looking on his helpless nakedness, although he had often seen Kendrick bathing in the river after a long, dusty hunt. The corpse's arms were covered with shallow slashes, now cleaned of blood, wounds of defense. The blood had been wiped from his chest and stomach as well, but there was no way to prettify these larger wounds. 6 straight gashes, livid along their edges, and deeply unsettlingly red in their depths. Not a sword, said the Lord Constable after a moment. He was breathing a little harshly, as if the sight disturbed him more than he let show. A knife? Perhaps, Chavin frowned. Perhaps a curved one? See how the cuts are wider on one end. A curved knife? Brone's bushy eyebrows slid up. He looked to Ferris, who felt his own heart speed with surprise and fear. "I know who has a knife like that," he said. "We all do," said the Lord Constable. Barrack's head felt hollow. The rustle of the blanket Bryony wore wrapped around her nightdress, the slap of his own feet, the murmur of the people in the corridor all rolled around his skull like the roar of the ocean in a seashell. He was finding it difficult to believe that what had just happened was real. "Prince Barrack," someone called one of the pages. "Is he really dead? Is our Lord Kendrick really dead?" Barrack did not dare speak. Only holding his teeth clenched together kept him from bursting into tears, or worse. Bryony waved the onlookers back, and they turned to beseech the hierarch Sizel for news instead, slowing his progress. At the end of the corridor, the twins turned toward the Erebor chapel, but then, at the next turning, Bryony walked swiftly in the wrong direction. No, this way," Barrack said dully, his poor sister lost in her own house. She shook her head and continued down the corridor, then turned again. "Where are we going?" "Not to the chapel." Her voice sounded strangely light, as though nothing unusual had happened. But when she turned toward him, a blasted emptiness was in her eyes, a look so unfamiliar that it terrified him. "They'll only find us there." What? What do you mean?" His sister took his arm and pulled him down another corridor. Only when they reached the old pantry door did he understand. "We haven't been here for years." She pulled a stub of candle from the shelf just inside, then turned back to light it from one of the wall sconces. When they pulled the door closed behind them, the light on the shelves cast all the familiar shadows that Barrack had once known, as well as the shape of his own knuckles. "Why didn't we go to the temple?" he asked. He was half afraid to hear the answer. He had never seen his sister like this. "Because they'll find us. Galen, the hierarch, all that lot. And then they'll make us do things." Her face was pale but intent. "Don't you understand?" "Understand what? Kendrick? Bryony, they killed Kendrick. Someone killed Kendrick." He wagged his head, trying to make sense. "But who?" His sister's eyes were bright with tears. "It doesn't matter. I mean, it does, but don't you see what's going to happen? They're going to make you Prince Regent, and they're going to send me to Hyrosol to marry Ludus Drakova. They'll be even more certain to do it now. They'll be terrified. They'll do anything to get father back. They're not the only ones." Barrack could not keep up with Bryony, who was thinking so quickly it seemed she had dived into a rushing river and left him on the bank, stuck in mud. Barrack couldn't think at all. It seemed the nightmares that plagued his sleep had stormed and conquered his waking life as well. Someone had to make things right again. He was astonished to hear himself say it, but at this moment it was true. "I want father back, too. I want him back." Bryony started to say something, but her lip was quivering. She sat down on the dusty floor of the pantry and wrapped her arms around her knees. "Poor Kendrick." She fought back the tears. "He was so cold, Barrack. Even before the end. He was shivering." She made a snuffling noise, pressed her face against her arms. Barrack looked up at the pantry ceiling, which undulated like water in the flickering candlelight. He wished he and Bryony were on a river together, floating away. "We used to hide from him here when we were little, remember? He used to get so angry when he couldn't find us. And it worked so many times. Even after Aunt Marilana told him he'd always forget." She looked up with a crooked smile. "Up and down the halls. 'Barrack! Bryony, I'll tell father!' He would get so angry." For a long moment they fell silent, listening for a phantom echo. "What are we going to do then?" I don't want to be the cursed Prince Regent. Beric considered. We can run away. If we're gone, they can't make me the Prince Regent, and they can't give you to Ludus. But who rules Southmarch? Bryony asked. Let Avon Brone do it, or that prig Galen. Gods know he wants to. All the more reason he shouldn't. Sister Uta says that people who want power are the first who should be mistrusted with it. But they're the only ones who want it. He crouched beside her. I don't want to be Prince Regent. Besides, why shouldn't it be you anyway? You're older. Even in the very pit of misery, his sister could not help smiling. You are such a wretched monster, Beric. That's the first time you have ever admitted that. And it was only a matter of moments anyway. Beric slumped down. He had no smile to give back. A poisonous weariness poured through his limbs, heart, and head like a gray fog, like a gray smoke fogging his thoughts. I want to die, that's what I want. Go with Kendrick. Much easier than running away. Don't you dare say that! Bryony grabbed his arm and leaned forward until her face was only a handspan from his. Don't you dare think about leaving me alone. For a moment, he almost told her. Gave up the secret he had hidden so long, all those nights of fear and misery. But the habit of years could not be so easily broken, even now. You're the one who will be leaving me, he said instead. In the middle of the long, dark silence that followed, someone rapped lightly on the pantry door. The twins, startled, looked at each other, eyes wide in the candlelight. The door scraped open. Their great-aunt, Duchess Marilana, stepped in. I knew you'd be here. You two. Of course you would be. They sent you after us, Bryony said accusingly. They did. Oh, they did. The whole castle is in terror looking for you. How could you be such wicked children? But Marilana was not as angry as she sounded. In fact, she seemed like another sleepwalker. Her pale, wide face, devoid of paint, looked like something dragged out of its burrow and into the sunlight. Don't you know? The worst thing you could do is to vanish like this after... A great choking gasp came out of Bryony, who crawled to Marilana and buried her face in the old woman's voluminous nightdress. Oh, Auntie Lana, they killed him. He's gone. Marilana reached down and stroked her back, although she was struggling to keep her balance against the girl's weight on her legs. I know, dear. Just our poor, sweet little Kendrick. And then the horrible fact of it climbed up Beric's backbone and into his head again. A ghastly, overwhelming thing that choked out all light and sense. And he clambered over to Marilana and wrapped his arms around her waist, forcing her off balance again. She had no choice but to claw at the shelves and let herself fold to the floor of the pantry in a great slipping and bunching of cloth. She held them both, with their heads together in her lap, their hair mingling like the waters of two rivers, red and gold, both of them weeping like small children. Marilana was crying again, too. Oh, my poor ducks, she said, looking at nothing, as tears ran down her wrinkled cheek. Oh, my poor little chickens. Yes, my poor dear ones. And that's where we're going to stop. Ouch. Because my joints aren't working anymore. No, that was where we were going to stop anyway, because that was the ending of that section. And there's more sections to go. So we've gone a little bit past 8 o'clock, which is okay, since there's no real time limit on this, although I try to keep it to the same slot for various reasons. And so I am going to wrap it up until next week, when we will return with more Shadowmarch here on the All the Time channel, except only once or twice a week time. But I will be back 7 p.m. next Sunday, my time, Pacific time. And then again at 2 a.m. on Sunday morning. 2 a.m. Sunday morning, and then 7 p.m. my time, both Sunday, both Pacific time. Why do I even try? I try to explicate things and I just make it worse. Anyway, so with that, I say thank you all so much. Much appreciated. You're joining me, and I will see you again very soon. And of course, I'll be online, so you can always find me online. And for those of you who would like to check out some of the back episodes or whatever, the readings are also available on YouTube, on tadwilliams.com, on through Twitter, and through Facebook. So if you really are a glutton for punishment, you can go find anything that you missed there. And with that, I will say farewell, auf Wiedersehen, and chitty chitty.